In 1800, the western half of North America looked almost empty on American maps. It was not empty. It was crowded with nations, trade routes, languages, governments, animals, and rival empires. Yet within roughly 100 years, the map would be almost unrecognizable. The United States would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Railroads would cross deserts once considered impassable. New states would appear where empires, tribal homelands, and open plains had stood. And the Wild West would become a national legend. But here's the strange part. The West was not built by fearless cowboys riding into empty land. It was built through confusion, speculation, broken treaties, private armies, gold fever, federal power, and astonishing luck. Sometimes a railroad timetable changed a town's future. Sometimes a rumor started a migration. Sometimes a government decision hundreds of miles away destroyed an entire way of life. So how did chaos create modern America?
The answer begins with a very inconvenient map. At the start of the 19th century, the United States was still a relatively narrow country. Its population clustered along the Atlantic coast in the Appalachian Mountains. Beyond that lay vast territories claimed by powerful neighbors. Spain controlled enormous lands to the south and west. Britain dominated much of the north. France held the giant Louisiana territory in the center. And indigenous nations controlled most of the land Americans dreamed about crossing. The United States wanted more territory. It wanted farmland, trade routes, ports, and security. It also wanted something less measurable: room. Many American settlers believed the Republic needed endless space to survive. That belief would later be called manifest destiny. It sounded grand. In practice, it meant somebody else was usually already living there. Then came the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, France sold Louisiana to the United States. On paper, the deal doubled the country's size. On the ground, almost nothing became simple. Nobody knew the exact western boundaries. Nobody knew which rivers led where. And nobody had asked the indigenous nations living there for permission. The purchase was less like buying a house. It was more like buying a giant, unexplored neighborhood from someone who did not own it. Still, the map had changed. American expeditions moved westward, looking for routes to the Pacific. Traders followed rivers and mountain passes. Fur companies built networks across enormous distances. And every successful journey made the frontier feel slightly less impossible. But geography was still in charge. The Rocky Mountains were brutal. The Great Plains looked dry, flat, and endless. Deserts punished people who arrived with poor maps and worse supplies. To cross the West, settlers needed knowledge. Much of that knowledge came from indigenous guides, traders, and communities. The frontier myth often shows lone pioneers conquering nature. The real story was messier. People survived because others had already understood the land. Then the pressure accelerated. In the 1840s, settlers moved into Texas, Oregon, and California. Texas had broken away from Mexico and later joined the United States. That annexation helped trigger war with Mexico. The war ended, with Mexico losing vast northern territories. Those lands included much of today's California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. The American map expanded again. But expansion created a new problem. Would slavery expand with it? Every new territory became a political landmine. If a new state allowed slavery, slaveholding interests gained power. If it banned slavery, their opponents gained power instead. So the West was never only about open land. It was also about who would control America's future. Then California found gold. In 1848, gold was discovered near Sacramento. News spread slowly at first. Then it exploded. Within months, people came from across the United States and around the world. They arrived by ship, wagon, mule, and desperate optimism. San Francisco transformed from a small settlement into a booming port.
Mining camps appeared almost overnight. Prices became absurd. A shovel could cost more than a worker's wages back east. Eggs became luxury goods. Some miners got rich. Most did not. The real winners were often merchants, transport companies, landowners, and people selling supplies. This became a classic Western pattern. The dream was gold. The business was everything surrounding gold. Gold also showed how quickly the West could become violent. Mining camps had weak institutions. Thousands of strangers arrived with competing claims. Racism, fraud, theft, and vigilante violence flourished. Laws existed, but enforcement often did not. When formal government was absent, people invented their own rules. Sometimes they formed juries.
Sometimes they formed mobs, and those are not remotely the same thing. California entered the Union quickly. The gold rush had turned distant territory into a political emergency. But the Western boom was not limited to California. Silver drew crowds to Nevada. Gold pulled miners toward Colorado and Montana. Cattle drew ranchers into Texas and the Plains. Railroads drew investors almost everywhere. The West became a giant magnet for people chasing a fresh start. It also became a giant machine for separating people from their money. Land companies promised fertile farms. Railroad companies advertised sunny opportunities. Speculators sold property in towns that barely existed. Sometimes the town had a hotel, a saloon, and nothing else. Yet posters promised a future metropolis. This was America's first great age of hype. And occasionally the hype worked. The railroad changed everything. Before railroads, crossing the continent was dangerous, slow, and expensive.
Wagon travel could take months. Weather could destroy a journey. Disease could do the rest. The transcontinental railroad connected eastern industry to western land and Pacific trade. When it was completed in 1869, the map suddenly shrank. A trip that once consumed seasons could take days. Goods moved faster, troops moved faster, news moved faster, and settlers moved faster than ever. That last part mattered enormously. Railroads were not just transportation, they were political weapons. They carried settlers into contested regions, they supplied forts, they linked distant markets, they allowed Washington to project power across mountains, deserts, and plains. The railroad made the West more connected. It also made it easier to control. For indigenous nations, this was devastating. Many had already faced disease, displacement, and military pressure. Now fences, trucks, farms, and towns cut through their territories. The bison herds were slaughtered at catastrophic scale. For many plains nations, bison were food, shelter, trade, and culture. Destroying the herds weakened resistance. It was not simply an environmental disaster. It was a strategic disaster for entire communities. The United States signed many treaties with indigenous nations. Then settlers wanted more land. Then the treaties were ignored, rewritten, or broken. This cycle repeated again and again. Conflict followed. The story is often told as cowboys versus warriors. That version is easy to package. It is also far too simple. These were wars over sovereignty, land, survival, and power. Indigenous nations were not a single side. They had different interests, alliances, and strategies. The United States was not always united either. Local settlers, federal officials, miners, soldiers, and railroad companies often wanted different things. But one force became increasingly decisive: the federal government.
The Civil War had strengthened federal institutions. After the war, Washington had more power, more soldiers, and more willingness to reshape the continent. It gave land grants to railroads. It opened territory to homesteaders. It created reservations. It deployed the army. It surveyed, taxed, sold, regulated, and enclosed. The Wild West looked lawless from far away, yet much of its transformation came from paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork. A survey line could become a future county border. A railroad grant could create a town. A treaty clause could remove a nation from its homeland. A homestead claim could become a family farm. Modern America was being built by rifles, yes, but also by clerks with maps. Now enter the cowboy. The cowboy was real, but the cowboy myth became much bigger than cowboy life. After the Civil War, Texas had enormous cattle herds. Eastern cities had growing demand for beef. Railroads reached Kansas towns like Abilene and Dodge City.
So cattle drives moved herds northward. Cowboys spent months in dust, rain, boredom, and danger. They slept poorly. They worked brutally long hours. They were often young, underpaid, and far from glamorous. Many were Mexican, black, indigenous, or immigrants. The famous cowboy image erased much of that diversity. It also erased the fact that cattle drives lasted for a relatively short period. Once railroads expanded deeper into Texas, the great drives became less necessary. Barbed wire helped end them too. This little invention changed the West more than many gunfights. Before barbed wire, open-range cattle ranching depended on wide, unfenced land. After barbed wire, property could be enclosed cheaply. Ranchers fenced water sources, farmers protected crops, landowners marked claims, and suddenly, the open frontier began closing. That caused range wars. Cattlemen, farmers, sheep herders, and speculators fought over access. Sometimes courts settled disputes. Sometimes hired guns did. This is where the Wild West earned its reputation. There were robberies, feuds, shootouts, and infamous outlaws. But here is another twist. Most Western towns were trying desperately to become respectable. They wanted banks, schools, churches, newspapers, and reliable property values. A town full of gunfire was bad for business. So many towns passed gun control rules. Visitors often had to surrender weapons inside town limits. The popular image says every street was a permanent duel. Reality says merchants preferred customers who survived until payday. Outlaws became famous partly because they were unusual. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and other figures became newspapers' favorite material. Their lives were exaggerated into legends almost immediately. Dime novels turned criminals into glamorous rebels. Later films made them symbols of rugged independence. But many outlaws were simply violent men exploiting weak enforcement. The West did not create freedom without rules. It showed what happened when rules arrived unevenly. Some people found opportunity. Others found eviction notices. Some became ranch owners. Others became wage laborers. Some struck gold. Others died searching for it. Then came the great agricultural gamble. The federal government encouraged settlers to farm the plains. Land was offered to homesteaders willing to live and work there. For a while, rain was generous. Promoters claimed that farming would permanently change the climate. They said, "Rain follows the plow." That was wishful thinking wearing a fancy hat. The plains were never guaranteed farmland. Drought returned, winds returned, harvests failed. Families discovered that a small plot could be too little for dry country farming. Yet settlement continued. The land was divided into grids. Roads followed section lines. Towns appeared at regular intervals along railroads. This grid still shapes the American landscape today. Look at much of the Midwest and West from above. You can see the old logic. Square fields, straight roads, rail towns, property lines cutting across older geography. The West was being organized into a machine. By the end of the 19th century, the frontier was changing again. The United States Census declared the frontier line no longer clearly visible. Americans treated this as a major emotional event. The country had spent generations imagining an open edge. Now that edge seemed gone. So America invented a more dramatic version of it. The Wild West shows began touring the country. They staged frontier life for crowds. Buffalo Bill became an international celebrity. Cowboys, sharpshooters, horses, and reenacted battles
turned history into entertainment. The frontier became a story just as it became less real. That story mattered. It taught Americans to see expansion as destiny. It made violence look cleaner than it was. It transformed complex indigenous nations into background characters. It made land conquest feel inevitable.
And it celebrated individual toughness while ignoring federal subsidies, railroads, and corporate power. The rugged individualist often arrived by train. So what did 100 years of Western chaos actually create? It created a continental economy. The West supplied minerals, cattle, wheat, timber, oil, and later water power. It connected American industry to the Pacific. It created cities that became national giants. Denver, Los Angeles, Seattle, Phoenix, Dallas, and many others grew from Western networks. It created new political battles over land, water, labor, and race. Those battles never really ended. Western water still determines where cities can grow. Rail lines still influence trade. Reservation boundaries still shape politics and daily life. Federal land ownership still covers huge parts of the region. And debates over borders, migration, extraction, and public land still carry Western history inside them. The modern United States did not emerge from a peaceful march across an empty continent. It emerged from collisions. Empires collided. Settlers collided with indigenous nations. Railroads collided with distance. Markets collided with nature. And myths collided with reality. The Wild West was not one simple era. It was a century-long struggle over who belonged, who ruled, and who got the land. That struggle created roads, cities, states, fortunes, and legends. It also created dispossession, inequality, and wounds that remain visible on the map. So how did chaos create modern America? By forcing a young country to connect a continent. By turning distant land into political power. By replacing open spaces with borders, tracks, fences, and laws. And by creating a national myth so powerful, Americans still argue with it today. The Wild West did not disappear. It became the America beneath the America.